A family falls victim to a horrific crime.
There was a large pool of blood on the floor.
My daughter did not show up for school.
She could be in danger herself. She could have been abducted by the killer.
As police race to find both a missing person and a killer, a dangerous game of cat and mouse ensues.
Unfortunately, while we were pinging the phone, the locations were delayed, and we did not know if he would survive or not.
The search for the truth will ultimately unveil a sordid tale of desperation, and at its heart are two young lovers fueled by desire and rage.
She felt like that's what she had to do to be with him.
When you have a young couple that is so infatuated and willing to do anything and everything, tragedy can happen.
I asked her, were you planning on doing that to me? And she told me yes.
Danville, Kentucky is a small town nestled in the heart of the state. Danville was also home to Rhonda Raines, who was well known to her neighbors for her kind and generous spirit.
Rhonda had a very outgoing personality. She was just a vibrant person, vibrant personality, never met a stranger.
Rhonda was the light in the room. She was just a bubbly person.
Raised in nearby Casey County, Rhonda married young and had 4 children, but her first marriage didn't last. And by her mid-30s, Rhonda found herself a single mother working hard to provide her kids with the best she could.
She was very giving. She adored her children.
Rhonda was in management. She worked at a factory that made magazines and had a very good position in where she worked and was very well liked.
By 2008, Rhonda's children were all grown and had moved out of the house, leaving Rhonda at 44 years old an empty nester and once again ready to give romance another shot. That's when she met 37-year-old Philip Oakley.
I met Rhonda at Old Bridge Golf Course. She had just got done playing golf, and she was in the bar area, and we met there. We had talked, and it seemed like we had chemistry, and so we were pretty much so together every day.
She's outgoing and bubbly, and he was more of the quiet kind of person. I guess opposites attract.
More than anything, the couple bonded over their families and experiences as single parents. Philip was recently divorced and still raising his 2 young children, Jenna and David.
They both lived with my ex-wife in Indiana. They came every other weekend. We were really, really close. My children are my world.
When Rhonda bonded quickly with both of his children, Philip knew he'd found the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with.
Rhonda, she was the kindest, sweetest, most giving person in the world. She is probably the best person that I've ever met in my life.
Their wedding was a quiet little small wedding at the country club.
The wedding was beautiful. Rhonda was beautiful. They looked very happy. She was all smiles, and he was too.
At first, the newlyweds were all on their own. But that changed just a few years later.
I had told my children that if they ever wanted to live with me, my door was open. I would love to have them live with me. I got a call one day. Jenna had said that her mother, they had gotten in an argument, and Jenna said she didn't want to stay there. And I said, that's fine. Come home with me.
Jenna was 15 when she moved in with her father in April of 2016. Her younger brother, 13-year-old David, soon followed. Rhonda welcomed both children into their home with loving arms.
You couldn't ask for a better stepmother than what she was with with Philip's children.
It wasn't long before both teenagers found their footing in living under Philip and Rhonda's roof. David was thriving, as was his sister.
Jenna did well with school. She was a cheerleader. She enjoyed all things that teenage girls enjoy.
The family was so happy, and Philip was in his quiet little way. You could tell he was happy.
But just 5 months later, the Oakley family would be torn apart by an unexpected and horrific tragedy. It starts on the afternoon of September 1st, 2016. At 4 p.m., 13-year-old David Oakley is dropped off by the school bus at Philip and Rhonda's home.
He got home from school, and part of his chores or things he did was load the dishwasher. And so he was working on the dishwasher, and the dogs, we had 3 dachshund puppies. They were downstairs in the basement barking.
Up to that moment, David had believed he was alone in the house. But the barking dogs suggested otherwise.
So he went downstairs to see what was wrong with the dogs, and they were digging at the door. And he said he opened the door and flipped the light on, and there lay Rhonda.
There was a large pool of blood on the floor.
He immediately went to a neighbor's house and had the neighbor call 911 that his stepmother was in the basement.
Police arrive on the scene a few minutes later, but it's soon obvious there's nothing that can be done to save Rhonda.
We found Miss Oakley deceased in the basement. Miss Oakley was laying on her back. She appeared to have several lacerations around her neck area. There was a trash bag laying right beside her body. There was a small piece of duct tape stuck to the black garbage bag.
It was highly unusual for this type of crime to happen at this particular time in a residential setting, and especially in an afternoon.
Police aren't on the scene long before Philip Oakley returns home from work and learns that his wife has been murdered.
I was driving home and I got to the end of the road. When I pulled up to the house, I saw police and ambulance. And my son, he was there and he was crying, and he had told me that Rhonda, he had told me that Rhonda was gone.
Police are able to confirm Philip had been at his job all day, quickly eliminating him as a possible suspect. Philip also can't think of anyone who might want to harm his wife. Meanwhile, investigators continue to search the crime scene.
There was a trash can, and it looked like someone had vomited inside the trash can.
Had Rhonda become sick, or did the killer get sick after viciously murdering her? Upstairs in the kitchen, police uncover another clue.
One of the officers noticed that a knife was missing from a knife set upstairs.
There was no evidence of a break-in. The windows were secure. The doors didn't appear to be that they'd been tampered with in any way.
When detectives relay their findings to Rhonda's husband, Philip, he immediately points out something that's missing from the driveway: Rhonda's car.
Her 2014 Honda Civic was missing, was supposed to be in the driveway.
And that isn't all that can't be found.
My son had said, Jenna's not here.
Nobody knew where she was at. The car was gone.
Coming up, Rhonda Oakley's murder investigation evolves into a possible kidnapping case.
Number one, we need to find Jenna Oakley.
She could have been abducted by the killer. She could be in danger herself.
And detectives get their first clue on a possible suspect.
What had happened between them? It's not right. That's illegal.
In Danville, Kentucky, 52-year-old Rhonda Oakley has been found stabbed to death in her home.
A crime like this in Danville sends shockwaves completely through the community.
And when detectives realize her stepdaughter, 15-year-old Jenna, and Rhonda's car are missing, they fear the worst is yet to come.
All possibilities had to be looked at, and Jenna Oakley's kidnap or death was a possibility at that point. She was missing.
Rhonda's husband and Jenna's father, Philip, tells police that Jenna may have been missing all day.
I was at work on my first break. I got a message from the school. They said my daughter Jenna did not show up for school.
At the time, Philip assumed Jenna had stayed home sick. But like police, he's now worried her disappearance is somehow connected with his wife's murder.
The detective came and talked to me, and I told him I just had a gut feeling. For whatever reason, I knew it.
Philip also thinks he knows who might be behind it all.
Philip told detectives that he and his wife Rhonda had discovered that Jenna was in this relationship with this adult male.
The man in question is 20-year-old Kenneth Nigh. Jenna met him while living with her mother in Indiana.
Jenna Oakley started the relationship with Kenneth Nigh several years prior to this, maybe as early as 11 or 12. And that's a huge age gap.
I asked Jenna where she had met him, and she had met him at school. They rode the same bus together. I guess he must have been in his latter years of high school, and she was younger than that, because of the age difference.
From what I have heard, when he met Jenna and she was attracted to him, he just kind of hung on to it.
What had happened between her and Kenny was not right. He shouldn't have done that. That's illegal.
When Philip and Rhonda had found out about the relationship, they'd immediately tried to put a stop to it.
They told her she couldn't see him. They took her cell phone away from her and tried to limit the way she could communicate with him.
While initially upset, Jenna had promised Philip and Rhonda she'd obey their rules and stop seeing Kenneth. And to make sure Kenneth stopped reaching out to Jenna, Philip had threatened to get the police involved.
I called Kenny, and I used a lot of choice words because I was angry that a grown man would have a relationship with a child. He promised me that he would break all contact and ties with Jenna. At the time, he sounded pretty genuine.
The conversation had convinced Philip and Rhonda they wouldn't have to worry about Kenneth Nigh any longer. But now that his wife has been murdered and his daughter is missing, Philip fears that Kenneth Nigh never intended on leaving Jenna alone.
So this is what we knew. What we didn't know was Kenneth Nigh involved. We did not know that. Was he in Kentucky? We weren't sure. So what we decided to do is we began researching Kenneth Nigh. They'd find out, obviously, he was from Indiana.
Detectives also learned that Kenneth is enlisted in the United States Army.
It was my understanding that he had joined shortly out of high school, and he was stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado, and he was currently active duty soldier.
If Kenneth is on duty in Colorado, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, for him to have traveled more than 1,100 miles to kill Rhonda and kidnap Jenna. But detectives still need to confirm that was the case.
I was at one time an active duty U.S. Marine. Military guys tend to trust military guys a little bit more than civilians. So I ended up contacting Fort Carson. What I got back from the command was that Kenneth Nigh wasn't what you would say the top tier of soldiers. He had petitioned for a conscientious objector to be able to discharge from the military.
Command tells detectives Kenneth wasn't morally opposed to the Army. He just wanted out as fast as possible.
He discovered that if he failed the physical fitness test, it would cycle him out of the Army quicker than being a conscientious objector.
According to his records, Kenneth Nigh had failed all of his physical fitness tests on purpose and was dishonorably discharged on August 31st, 2016. The day before Rhonda Oakley was murdered.
I learned he was taken to an airport outside of Fort Carson, Colorado, and then he was given a plane ticket to Indiana.
Detectives look into the plane ticket purchased for Kenneth and discover that the destination had been changed shortly before Kenneth departed Colorado.
What we found out, at some point, Kenneth Nigh changed his flight.
Mr. Nigh actually flew into the Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky on August the 31st.
And he landed about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3:30 in the afternoon.
Lexington is only 40 miles from the Oakley's home in Danville, leaving detectives to surmise that Kenneth had traveled there to see Jenna, or even kidnap her.
I actually contacted the Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky. We obtained and then viewed the airport footage of him getting off the plane and walking through the airport. I tracked him through the airport and where he actually got into a taxi service.
Detectives locate the driver of the taxi, who easily recalls the passenger from just a day before.
He was talking to someone on the phone and said his name was Kenny and had just got out of the Army.
The taxi driver looks up the drop-off location, and it is Philip and Rhonda Oakley's home address. Kenneth had told the driver that the Oakleys were old friends he'd come to visit.
Kenneth and I actually told him to stop, that he wanted to surprise them, and then got out at the end of the road.
Kenneth had been walking toward the Oakley's home as the driver pulled away.
So then we knew that Kenneth and I arrived in Kentucky on Philip and Rhonda Oakley Street on August 31st. And the homicide happened on September the 1st.
Coming up, fearing for Jenna's life, police get their first lead on Kenneth Nigh's location.
The ping was in Glasgow, Kentucky, about an hour and a half away.
But we had no idea if Jenna was with him at this point. We still don't know if they were together.
And new evidence emerges that turns the case upside down.
She didn't look like she was injured.
The investigation into the murder of Rhonda Oakley has taken a shocking turn. Detectives believe 20-year-old Kenneth Nigh killed Rhonda and kidnapped her 15-year-old stepdaughter and Kenneth's ex-girlfriend, Jenna Oakley.
Once the family had found out about the relationship, Mr. Oakley had called Kenneth Nigh and forbid the relationship and informed Jenna that the relationship was forbidden.
When Kenneth Nigh was named as a possible person of interest, then we were starting to ask questions. Did he kidnap Jenna Oakley after this crime was committed, and was he holding her hostage?
It's actually quite concerning as to whether or not there's another victim.
Police are determined to track Kenneth down and bring Jenna home safe and sound. Jenna's family is also able to help the search by providing police Kenneth's cell phone number, which detectives hope will give them a lead on Kenneth's possible whereabouts.
Under extensive circumstances like this, where somebody's life could be in danger, we contact the carrier and they can ping a location of a cell phone.
Luckily, detectives get a response almost immediately.
The ping was showing Kenneth Nigh was in Glasgow, Kentucky, about an hour and a half away. So then we knew for a fact at least Kenneth Nigh's phone was in Kentucky. We were assuming Kenneth Nigh was in Kentucky.
But we had no idea if Jenna was with him at this point. We still don't know if they were together.
So what we did, we sent out a broadcast. We call it a BOLA. Be on the lookout for this 2014 Honda Civic for Kenneth Nigh and Jenna Oakley.
We continued to ping his phone to try to find him in hopes that would lead us to Jenna.
A little bit later, pinged again around Nashville, Tennessee, around I-65. So I kind of made an educated guess. Okay, so he's already traveled west. Now he's going south. Either he's going to continue south on I-65 or he's going to go west on I-40 from Nashville to Memphis.
Detectives know they need to be one step ahead of Kenneth Nigh if they are going to apprehend him. But that is proving to be a problem.
Unfortunately, while we were pinging the phone, the locations were delayed.
To get a GPS coordinates on a phone has to be on and active. The cell phone company was saying the phone was coming online and then going back off. We were getting probably a 30 to 45 minute delay. So it was really frustrating.
I don't know if this was intentional on the part of Kenneth Nigh, but the pings became less frequent.
I speculated that Kenneth Nigh may think that we were trying to track his phone.
As detectives struggle to track Kenneth's movement, a tip comes in from a Danville store manager who saw Jenna's picture on the news.
Jenna Oakley was seen the day of the murder at a local retail store.
We obtained surveillance footage, and we were able to actually see Jenna and Kenneth Nigh enter that store together. After the
Further, and actually saw them walk to a white sedan, matching the description of Rhonda Oakley's vehicle.
The video confirms that Jenna was with Kenneth. But what interests police most is the couple's interaction.
She didn't look like she was in any type of distress. She didn't look like she was injured.
Jenna didn't look like she was forced into any situation. She looked like she was moving freely. It looked like they were in a hurry to get a couple items and get out.
For police, the video footage opens the door to a disturbing possibility.
After seeing the surveillance video, we were starting to feel more confident maybe that Jenna was maybe not in danger, but she could possibly be a suspect in what happened to her stepmother, Rhonda Oakley.
Surely a 15-year-old couldn't kill her stepmother. How in the world could that possibly happen?
Coming up, police pick up the couple's trail more than 1,000 miles away.
I was anxious to get out there and get her.
But will Kenneth give up without a fight?
I got pretty scared, so I did pull my firearm.
That was a shot in the gut.
Kentucky State Police have launched a nationwide manhunt for 20-year-old Kenneth Nigh and 15-year-old Jenna Oakley for questioning in the brutal murder of Jenna's stepmother, 52-year-old Rhonda Oakley.
We were still not clear exactly what role Kenneth Nigh was playing in maybe some type of coercion to have her come along.
Detectives are tracking the couple's movement by pinging Kenneth's cell phone.
Now we're in their second day. We're getting locations every 2 or 3 hours. They were traveling west on I-40.
The pinging of the phone indicated a route taken through Tennessee, through Arkansas, through Oklahoma. This was an on-again, off-again contact.
We weren't sure where they were going, but we knew the direction. We kept issuing out bolos for this vehicle.
Detectives also keep Rhonda and Jenna's family updated.
They found pretty quickly that Jenna was with him on her own volition. He wasn't holding her hostage. That was one of the hardest times of my life.
There were a lot of mixed feelings about this. Some people thinking she is a suspect. Some people thinking she was the victim.
They were pretty sure that they weren't looking for a missing child. Though we didn't know who did it. Did he do it? Did she do it?
Jenna's family also helps the investigation by uncovering an important new clue. While searching Jenna's bedroom, they find her journal, and what the teenager had written inside is both illuminating and deeply disturbing.
A lot of the journals, she sounded like an older girl. She talked about her relationship with Kenneth, and they were so in love and they were going to get married.
It's clear that Jenna's feelings for Kenneth had never wavered, even after her father and stepmother had forced them to break up.
It was quite obvious that she had an ongoing romantic relationship with Kenneth Nigh. It continued even with Philip Oakley's best efforts to stop that contact.
Jenna's journal entries also make it clear that she didn't expect her father and stepmother to be an obstacle for her relationship with Kenneth much longer.
She wrote, "My family's going to be dead soon."
There was an entry that indicates that Jenna had thoughts of killing not only Rhonda Oakley, but possibly her father and her brother.
Jenna had wrote that she hated me and hated Rhonda, but it didn't matter how bad she hated us because we were going to be dead soon.
Police aren't sure why Jenna and Kenneth didn't follow through with the plan to murder the rest of her family. What the journal entries make crystal clear, however, is that 15-year-old Jenna Oakley is nothing short of a cold-blooded killer.
It made me physically ill. Rhonda took care of her. Rhonda took her shopping. Rhonda took her to cheerleading and took her to school, to her school events. How do you do that to somebody?
To know that my daughter was involved in doing this, it killed me. And so it was tough.
As Jenna's family copes with this disturbing reality, the Kentucky State Police get a new lead in their effort to locate the couple through tracking Kenneth's cell phone.
2 days after the murder, we got two pretty close identical pings in the same area, which means they're stationary now, and we may be able to locate them. As in Tucumcari, New Mexico.
Tucumcari, New Mexico is more than 1,000 miles from Danville, Kentucky. Kentucky State Police immediately notified Tucumcari law enforcement to be on the lookout for the couple in Rhonda Oakley's stolen car. Cell phone data helps police narrow down the car's location to one of two truck stops right off the interstate.
After patrolling the truck stops, I looked at every white vehicle I saw there. Nothing added up to the Kentucky license plate numerics or to the description of the two individuals inside. So I proceeded to Route 66 Boulevard and was checking the local hotels there for the vehicle. And just out of the corner of my eye, I had seen a white sedan vehicle that matched the description that I was looking for.
Detective Birch pulls behind the vehicle in the motel parking lot.
I got out of the driver's seat and approached the vehicle. I could see two young subjects. The female subject was kind of leaned up against him, like they were getting some sleep. I remember having my flashlight and I shined it in the vehicle, and she got spooked. She woke up and her eyes were very wide. She jumped into the driver's seat right away. And I said, "Roll the window down." And that's when she started the vehicle. That's when I got pretty scared. So I did pull my firearm for precaution, and I kept it pointed towards the ground, but I kept it close. When Kenneth saw my firearm drawn, that's when he started talking to her. I think he told her to turn the vehicle off because she shut the vehicle off. He looked like he had been caught. When he stepped out of the vehicle, he did it very calmly, showing his hands. Jenna Oakley complied, but she was agitated. She had high emotions.
Kenneth and Jenna are both handcuffed and put in separate vehicles.
I remember she was saying, "Tell Kenneth I love him." And she kept saying that, "Make sure you tell him I love him." I think that she realized she wasn't going to see him for a good while now.
Jenna is moved to a juvenile detention center, and Kenneth is placed in an adult prison, while authorities begin working to extradite the couple back to Kentucky. A complicated process slowed down even further because Jenna is a juvenile.
The issue of bringing parties back takes a joint effort with authorities both in Kentucky and New Mexico.
I had talked to the police. They had told me it would be a few days before they were able to get down there and pick them up.
We obviously want to get back to Kentucky. I was anxious to get out there and get her.
While they wait for extradition, law enforcement in Kentucky asks New Mexico State Police to search Rhonda's car.
Is the murder weapon in the car? Is Rhonda Oakley's blood in the car? Can we find any clothing that they might have been wearing in the car?
When I looked in the vehicle, it was obvious they'd been living in it. There was food, clothes, snacks, energy drinks. You could tell they were definitely traveling without stopping.
But the murder weapon is nowhere to be found. And on September 5th, 2 days after the arrest, the case takes another unexpected turn.
Someone had called me and stated that online, where you can check inmate statuses, that Kenny was released.
We were notified that he had been released from custody. And I'm thinking, why? What the heck's going on?
Philip Oakley immediately alerts Kentucky law enforcement that Kenneth has been released from the New Mexico jail where he'd been held.
When I started calling out there, trying to find out why he's released, we learned that Mr. Nigh had attempted suicide in the detention center, and they had taken him to a medical facility for treatment.
Mr. Nigh did use a blanket that was tied to a hook on the wall and hung himself from that hook using the blanket.
We did not see that coming. The prognosis we got was not good.
He was in critical condition, and we did not know if he would survive or not.
Coming up, with Kenneth's survival in question, police are left with several unanswered questions. Was Kenneth Nigh the mastermind behind Rhonda Oakley's murder? Or was he just a pawn in Jenna's master plan?
It just gave me cold chills. He was just brutal.
It's hard to describe. You just can't get your head around it.
After 15-year-old Jenna Oakley and her boyfriend, 20-year-old Kenneth Nigh, are arrested in New Mexico for the murder of Jenna's stepmother, Rhonda Oakley, police in Danville, Kentucky receive shocking news about Kenneth.
He attempted suicide by hanging the evening of September the 5th in a New Mexico jail. He was on life support. He had no brain activities.
A suicide note is discovered in Kenneth's jail cell.
He basically tried to take full responsibility for the acts and made an attempt to exonerate Jenna from any responsibility.
I would say it was his way of saying goodbye to her.
Was Kenneth telling the truth? It's hard to reconcile his claim with Jenna's chilling journal entries.
The way that she was portraying her emotions out on paper was saying she wasn't concerned about her family not approving of their relationship because her family would be dead soon. We start leaning towards premeditation.
Kentucky police will have to wait until Jenna is in their custody to question her. Finally, on September 12th, 9 days after her capture, investigators get the green light to extradite Jenna from New Mexico back to Kentucky.
At this point, Jenna had no idea that Kenneth Nigh had attempted suicide, and we did not tell her that Mr. Nigh had attempted suicide.
And we just sat down with Jenna and advised her of Miranda warning. She agreed to speak with us.
Jenna confirms what her journal suggested, that she and Kenneth never ended their relationship after her parents forbade her from seeing him.
Jenna was still communicating with Kenny through a friend's phone at school.
When detectives asked Jenna about the events of September 1st, she admits that Kenneth had secretly spent the night with her in her bedroom the night before her stepmother's murder.
The next day, September the 1st, Philip went to work, and Jenna said she wakes up and doesn't go to school. Her and Kenneth stayed there all day, downstairs, and then it got to be around 3:30, and she heard footsteps upstairs. Rhonda came home early. So Rhonda comes downstairs into the basement. Kenneth Nigh hides in her bedroom, and Rhonda begins questioning her, why you didn't go to school, what's going on? And the questioning turns into a really heated argument, and Jenna grabs Rhonda. They get into a struggle, and Jenna is trying to choke Rhonda. And Kenneth comes out of the bedroom, grabs Rhonda from behind and puts her in a chokehold, and then Rhonda passes out. They drag Rhonda into the other bedroom, and Jenna retrieves the knife and stabs Rhonda 4, 5, 6 times in the neck. And she starts bleeding really bad. Rhonda dies, and they cover her mouth with duct tape and cover her face with a plastic bag.
Police are stunned by Jenna's confession. She claims Kenneth had also been disturbed by what she had done.
She said after they killed Rhonda that Kenneth and I had got sick and threw up in a garbage can.
Which matches crime scene the day of the homicide. We found vomit in the trash can.
Jenna confirms the murder weapon had come from the knife block in the kitchen, and that she disposed of it shortly after they hit the road.
She said while she was on 127 in Kentucky, they stopped at a fast food chain, and while they were walking in, she threw it in the trash can. When you talk to juveniles, a lot of times they'll break down and cry, or they'll get emotional. During Jenna's interview, I didn't get that vibe. I didn't get that remorse. I didn't get that compassion. I just felt cold in the air.
To me, it means that she had it all planned out. She knew exactly what she was going to do. And she just needed to let Kenny know.
At that time, it's my understanding Jenna did not know the condition of Kenneth Nigh, which I believe might have been relevant to her statement. She gave a statement basically accepting responsibility for committing the crime and actually downplayed Kenneth Nigh's role.
To know that my own child would do this to the woman that I loved and bring all this pain on her friends and family, that's a lot of anger. How would someone that you've watched grow up be capable of doing something so heinous?
Desperate for answers to these questions, Philip Oakley is allowed a phone call with his daughter.
I asked Jenna, why didn't y'all just run away together? Why did you have to do what you did? And she had told me that it's not that easy. You don't understand. You don't understand. And I asked her, were you planning on doing that to me? And she told me yes.
I don't know what Jenna was hoping to gain from this. I feel like that her infatuation with this Kenneth Nigh, I guess she felt like that's what she had to do to be with him.
It almost goes to show you that when you have a young couple that is so infatuated, so bent on staying together and willing to do anything and everything, tragedy can happen.
Jenna Oakley is formally charged with the first-degree murder of her stepmother, Rhonda Oakley. Kenneth Nigh is charged with harboring a minor, but he never steps foot inside a courtroom.
He was on life support. He ended up dying about 6 weeks later.
When Jenna finally learns of his death at a pretrial hearing, she's devastated.
I was actually in the courtroom. The attorney went in there and told Jenna, and I heard her in the courtroom screaming and crying.
It isn't long after the hearing that Jenna's attorneys approach prosecutors about a possible plea bargain.
When the prosecutor had talked to me about a plea agreement, he didn't know how a jury would look at it because she is so young.
We make a plea offer based upon the circumstances. That offer was a plea to a manslaughter in the first degree with a 10-year sentence. On top of that, there was another 5-year sentence for the theft of the car to reach a total sentence of 15 years.
I cannot tell you how very sorry I am for all of the pain, hurt, anger, and frustration that it has caused.
She did make a statement to the court saying that she was sorry. That's the first time that I'd ever heard Jenna say, I'm sorry about anything to do with this. And I think she only said that because she was trying to get a lighter sentence, trying to get some leniency from the court.
Whatever Jenna's intentions may have been, the judge ultimately sentences her to the maximum 15 years. But many, including Jenna's own family, believe that justice was not served.
The plea bargain was horrible. We all were shocked that they were willing to drop it to manslaughter. It was so thought out and planned and calculated, and I don't think the sentence fit the crime.
I absolutely disagreed with 10 years for the murder and 5 years for stealing the car. I thought Rhonda deserved better than that.
Do I think she should have got way more time? Yes. You know, why does she deserve a shorter amount of time? Because she's my daughter. You know, I've always told my children, there's consequences in life to your actions. Rhonda can never come back and see her grandkids. Rhonda can never come back and have a birthday. But yet Jenna, at some point, she's going to be out of prison. Why is that fair?
Rhonda did not deserve this. Rhonda was just a tremendous human being. She was just a spectacular person.
In the winter of 1929, the city of Dusseldorf stopped trusting the night. Parents who once allowed their children to walk home alone now waited anxiously at windows long after sunset, scanning empty streets beneath weak yellow lamps. Shopkeepers closed early. Women traveled in groups whenever possible. Police patrols moved through narrow alleyways with growing urgency, their footsteps echoing against wet cobblestones while newspapers printed fresh headlines almost every morning. Somewhere in the city, people believed a predator was hunting at random. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew where he would strike next. What terrified the public most was not only the violence itself, but the complete unpredictability of it. The victims did not belong to one neighborhood, one age group, or one social class. Children disappeared. Women were attacked on quiet roads. Ordinary workers heading home after dark became targets. The killer seemed to move through Dusseldorf like a shadow, without pattern or logic, leaving behind scenes so brutal that even experienced investigators struggled to understand what they were seeing. Before long, the newspapers gave him a name that would spread fear across Germany: the Vampire of Dusseldorf. It was not merely a sensational headline. The name emerged because investigators and journalists began hearing deeply disturbing claims connected to the murders. The attacker appeared fascinated by blood. Later, during interrogations, the man responsible would admit that the sight of blood aroused him sexually. He confessed that watching blood flow from victims created in him what he described as overwhelming excitement. Those revelations transformed public fear into something even darker. Citizens no longer believed they were searching for a normal criminal. Rumors spread rapidly through cafes, train stations, apartment buildings, and factory floors. Some whispered that the killer was insane. Others believed there must be several murderers working together because no single person could commit crimes so varied and so savage. In poor districts of the city, parents warned children not to speak to strangers under any circumstances. Stories circulated about a monster walking the streets at night searching for victims. And as panic grew, the line between rumor and reality slowly began to disappear. Yet beneath the terrifying nickname and the flood of newspaper stories stood a real man. His name was Peter Curtin. He was not a mysterious figure hiding in abandoned buildings or lurking permanently in darkness. He moved among ordinary people unnoticed. He drank in taverns. He read newspapers describing his own crimes. According to later reports, he even returned to crime scenes to observe the reactions of police officers and frightened crowds. That detail alone remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. While the city panicked, the man responsible calmly watched fear spread through the population he had terrorized. But the story of Peter Curtin did not begin in 1929. Long before the murders shocked Germany, long before newspapers created the image of a vampire, there were signs that something deeply wrong had been growing inside him for years. Investigators and psychologists who later studied the case would point to a childhood shaped by violence, humiliation, alcoholism, and sexual abuse. None of those things excuse what he eventually became. Thousands of people survive terrible childhoods without harming others. But in Curtin's case, many experts believe those early experiences formed the foundation for the sadistic compulsions that later emerged in adulthood. By the time Dusseldorf realized a serial killer was operating within the city, the violence had already escalated beyond control. The attacks carried a level of overkill that disturbed even hardened detectives. Some victims suffered dozens of stab wounds despite already being dead. Medical examiners concluded that many of the injuries served no practical purpose in committing murder. The violence itself appeared to be the point. That realization forced investigators to confront a horrifying possibility. They were hunting someone who killed not from anger, greed, revenge, or desperation, but for psychological gratification, for pleasure. And perhaps the most frightening element of all was how ordinary Curtin appeared on the surface. Serial murder cases often create myths around offenders, transforming them into creatures somehow separate from humanity. But Peter Curtin was not supernatural. He was a human being capable of blending into everyday life while hiding compulsions so violent that entire communities became trapped in fear. That contradiction haunted the public then, and it continues haunting true crime history today. How could someone live among neighbors, co-workers, and strangers while secretly committing acts of unimaginable brutality? How many opportunities were missed before the killings escalated? And how does a city recover after realizing evil was not hiding outside society, but quietly moving within it the entire time? During the height of the panic, police pressure intensified daily. Officers worked exhausting hours chasing leads that often led nowhere. Citizens flooded authorities with rumors and accusations. The press demanded answers. Yet despite the growing number of attacks, investigators struggled to establish a consistent pattern. Different weapons had been used. Victims varied widely. Crime scenes appeared chaotic. At times it seemed impossible that one offender could be responsible for everything. Meanwhile, the killer continued watching, continued reading, continued moving unnoticed through the same streets, now paralyzed by fear. The case would eventually become one of the most infamous serial murder investigations in European history, not only because of its brutality, but because it forced criminologists and psychologists to examine the relationship between violence, sexuality, compulsion, and public terror in ways few previous cases had done before. The murders committed by Peter Curtin would later influence criminal psychology for decades. His confessions became central to studies involving sexual sadism and what German criminologists called Lustmord, murder committed for psychological or sexual gratification. Yet behind every analysis, every newspaper headline, and every courtroom report were real victims whose lives ended in terror. Children who never returned home, women who trusted the wrong stranger, families left permanently shattered by violence they could neither predict nor comprehend. That is what makes the story endure. Not the mythology surrounding the killer, but the devastating human cost left behind him. And perhaps no moment captures the disturbing psychology of Peter Curtin more clearly than the words. He reportedly spoke before his execution in 1931. Facing death by guillotine, he asked a question so grotesque, so detached from ordinary human fear, that it stunned those who heard it. He wondered whether, after his head had been severed, he would still be able to hear the sound of his own blood rushing from his neck. Even at the very end, blood remained at the center of his thoughts. The statement cemented his reputation in public memory as the vampire of Dusseldorf. But it also revealed something else, a mind so consumed by violent obsession that even death itself became, to him, another source of fascination. And that leaves us with the central question at the heart of this case. How does a human being become capable of that kind of thinking? To answer it, we have to go back long before Dusseldorf fell into fear, back to a violent childhood, back to the early signs that were ignored, back to the making of Peter Curtin, long before the newspapers called him the vampire of Dusseldorf, before police patrols filled the streets at night and citizens locked their doors in fear. Peter Curtin was simply another child growing up inside poverty and violence in late 19th century Germany. He was born in 1883 into a household that investigators and criminologists would later describe as deeply unstable and abusive. The family lived in extreme hardship, struggling financially while existing under the constant shadow of fear created by Curtin's father, an alcoholic whose brutality shaped nearly every aspect of domestic life. Accounts from later investigations described a home where violence was ordinary. Physical abuse was common. The children reportedly witnessed horrifying acts committed against their mother, including sexual violence inflicted openly within the household. Years later, Curtin's father would also be arrested for sexually abusing his own daughter. Even by the standards of an era in which domestic abuse was often hidden and rarely discussed publicly, the environment surrounding the Curtin family stood out as exceptionally disturbing. Modern discussions about violent offenders often struggle with an important question: how much responsibility belongs to personal choice, and how much can be traced to childhood trauma? In the case of Peter Curtin, investigators and psychologists never suggested that abuse alone created a serial killer. Countless people endure terrible childhoods without ever harming another human being. But the atmosphere surrounding Curtin's upbringing mattered because it normalized cruelty during his earliest years. Violence was not an occasional event in that household. It was woven into everyday life. Fear became routine. Humiliation became routine. Suffering became routine. For a child already vulnerable to psychological disturbance, those experiences may have helped shape a deeply distorted understanding of power, control, and human pain. By the time Curtin was still very young, disturbing behavioral patterns had already begun to emerge. According to later reports and confessions, he developed a fascination with blood early in life. He reportedly tortured animals and derived emotional excitement from watching them suffer. Criminologists examining the case years later identified this behavior as one of the clearest early warning signs. Animal cruelty alone does not automatically predict future homicide, but in many severe violent offender cases, Investigators later uncover histories involving escalating acts of cruelty carried out long before crimes against humans begin. In Curtin's case, the connection between violence and psychological gratification appeared to develop unusually early. He was also known for theft and arson during childhood. Setting fires became another recurring behavior connected to excitement and control. There is something deeply unsettling about these details because they reveal not simply rebellion or juvenile delinquency, but repeated attempts to create destruction for emotional stimulation. Investigators later believed that Curtin increasingly associated fear and suffering with pleasure. Over time, those impulses would evolve into something far more dangerous. One of the most disturbing claims Curtin made during later interrogations involved the deaths of two boys during his childhood. He allegedly admitted that when he was around 9 years old, he caused 2 children to drown. At the time, authorities believed the deaths were accidental, and no suspicion focused on Curtin. Whether investigators fully understood the truth remains impossible to know. But the confession itself horrified those studying the case because it suggested that homicidal impulses may have existed decades before the murders that later terrorized Dusseldorf. If the confession was accurate, then Peter Curtin's violence did not suddenly emerge in adulthood. It had been growing quietly since childhood, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. And that hidden quality became one of the defining features of the man he would become. Because outwardly, Curtin often appeared capable of functioning normally in society. He did not present himself as a monstrous figure wandering visibly outside civilization. He blended in. He worked. He socialized. He moved through public spaces without attracting immediate suspicion. That contradiction would later become central to the fear surrounding the case. People wanted to believe evil looked unmistakable. But Peter Curtin demonstrated something far more frightening. A person capable of extraordinary brutality could also appear calm, ordinary, even polite. As Curtin entered adulthood, the darker elements of his psychology did not disappear. They intensified. The fascination with blood and violence evolved into sexualized sadism. According to later confessions, the sight of blood became directly linked to sexual arousal. Investigators would eventually conclude that violence itself had become psychologically inseparable from gratification in his mind. This was not murder driven by financial motive, revenge, or spontaneous rage. The violence fulfilled compulsions rooted deeply inside him. Understanding that distinction became essential for criminologists studying the case later. By the early 20th century, Germany itself was changing rapidly. Industrial cities like Dusseldorf expanded with growing working-class populations. Factories, rail systems, taverns, and crowded residential neighborhoods created busy urban environments filled with strangers passing each other daily. For most citizens, life revolved around ordinary concerns: work, family, survival, and recovery from economic hardship. Children played in streets and courtyards. Women traveled through parks and roads connecting industrial districts. Workers returned home late after exhausting shifts. These routines created the rhythm of everyday life inside the city. And it was precisely within that ordinary world that Peter Curtin would eventually hunt. One of the most tragic aspects of serial murder cases is the randomness experienced by victims. Looking backward through history, people often search for clues or warning signs that might have prevented tragedy. But for victims living in the moment, life usually appears entirely normal until the instant danger arrives. The future victims connected to Curtin's crimes were not participating in reckless behavior or entering obviously dangerous situations. They were children walking familiar routes, women speaking to someone who seemed harmless, ordinary citizens existing within routines they had followed countless times before. The randomness amplified public terror because it suggested that anyone could become a target. Yet before Dusseldorf entered its most violent period, there was already a major warning sign in Curtin's history. In 1913, years before the Panic of 1929, he committed what is widely regarded as his first confirmed murder. According to reports later connected to the case, Curtin entered near Mulheim intending to steal money. During the burglary, he encountered a sleeping child named Christine Klein. The attack that followed revealed an extraordinary level of violence. He strangled and stabbed the girl repeatedly before fleeing the scene. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing detail came afterward. Later accounts stated that Curtin returned to the inn and sat among people discussing the horrifying crime. He drank while listening to conversations about the murder he himself had committed. Investigators later believed he derived satisfaction not only from the violence itself, but from observing fear and confusion spreading through others. That emotional thrill, the secret knowledge that he alone understood the truth while everyone else speculated helplessly, became an important part of his psychological pattern. Yet even after that killing, Peter Curtin remained free. Years passed. Life in Dusseldorf continued. Citizens could not know that somewhere within the city lived a man whose compulsions had not disappeared, but merely waited. During those years, the hidden danger grew more severe. The fantasies involving blood, violence, and domination intensified internally until eventually they erupted into the series of attacks that would transform Dusseldorf into one of the most terrified cities in Germany. By 1929, the violence accelerated dramatically. Victims appeared from multiple social backgrounds and age groups. The attacks became more frenzied. Newspapers struggled to keep up with the growing fear spreading through the population. Parents warned children not to travel alone after dark. Police increased patrols. Rumors circulated daily. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this period was how ordinary life still continued alongside the terror. Trains still arrived each morning. Workers still filled factories. Restaurants still served customers. Children still laughed in schoolyards. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to continue living even while fear surrounds them. And somewhere among the crowds moving through Dusseldorf streets during those months walked Peter Curtin, appearing outwardly no different from anyone else. The victims whose lives would later become part of this case were individuals with futures abruptly stolen from them. Some were children whose names appeared briefly in newspapers before becoming part of criminal history. Others were women who trusted someone they believed harmless. In many true crime cases, the notoriety of offenders overshadows the people harmed by them. But understanding the atmosphere of Dusseldorf before the murders means remembering that these victims existed first as ordinary human beings, not simply as names connected to violence. They lived within families and communities that would never fully recover from what happened. And as the attacks escalated, one terrible realization slowly began spreading through the city. The predator responsible was not stopping. He was becoming more confident, more compulsive, more dangerous. Soon, Dusseldorf would enter the bloodiest stage of the nightmare. The city still did not know his name, but Peter Curtin was already watching, waiting, and preparing for the violence that would make him infamous across Europe. By the time Dusseldorf entered 1929, fear was no longer an abstract possibility. It had become part of everyday life. Newspapers carried reports of violent attacks with alarming frequency, and citizens began changing their routines in ways both subtle and dramatic. Parents stopped allowing children outside after dark. Women avoided isolated streets and parks. Conversations in cafes and taverns increasingly turned toward rumors of a killer moving through the city. Nobody understood exactly who the attacker was or why the crimes appeared so chaotic. But one fact became impossible to ignore: the violence was escalating. The attacks connected to Peter Curtin did not follow a simple pattern that investigators could easily predict. Some victims were children, others were adult women. Some attacks appeared spontaneous, while others suggested planning and manipulation. Different weapons were used, including knives, scissors, and hammers. Certain victims were strangled. Others suffered repeated stabbing injuries far beyond what investigators considered necessary to cause death. This apparent inconsistency created confusion within law enforcement. Detectives struggled to determine whether they were hunting one offender or several unrelated attackers operating simultaneously across the region. Meanwhile, Curtin continued moving unnoticed through the same streets, now gripped by panic. One of the most chilling aspects of the case is how ordinary his public behavior often appeared. He did not isolate himself from society after attacks. According to later accounts, he immersed himself in the fear his crimes created. He followed newspaper coverage closely. He reportedly revisited locations connected to the murders in order to watch public reactions and police activity. The terror spreading across Dusseldorf was not an unintended consequence of his violence. Investigators later concluded that the fear itself became part of the gratification he experienced. Long before the public knew the nickname, the Vampire of Dusseldorf, there had already been warnings hidden in Curtin's past. In 1913, years before the citywide panic, he committed what investigators later identified as his first confirmed murder. The victim was a young girl named Christine Klein. According to reports connected to the case, Curtin entered near Mulheim intending to steal money. The burglary itself appeared opportunistic rather than carefully planned. But inside the building, he encountered Christine asleep. What followed revealed an extraordinary level of violence that investigators would later recognize as consistent with the compulsions driving his later crimes. He attacked the child by strangling and stabbing her repeatedly. The brutality shocked the community. But what happened afterward disturbed investigators even more once Curtin eventually confessed, instead of fleeing permanently or hiding in fear after the murder. He returned to the inn and sat among people discussing the crime. He drank while listening to conversations about the killing he himself had committed. That detail exposed something psychologically significant. Curtin did not merely enjoy violence. He appeared to enjoy secrecy, manipulation, and the emotional power created by knowing he alone possessed the truth while others remained terrified and confused. For years after that murder, life continued. The crime did not immediately lead to his capture. Dusseldorf moved forward unaware that the same man would later unleash a far greater wave of violence. When the attacks accelerated dramatically in 1929, investigators initially failed to connect everything together. The victims appeared too varied. The methods differed too much. Some crimes involved children, others adults. Some victims survived attacks, while others did not. The randomness amplified fear because citizens realized there was no clear way to protect themselves. Anyone could become a target. One of the murders that deeply shocked the public involved 8-year-old Rosa Olliger. Her death became one of the defining moments in the city's growing panic. In February 1929, Rosa's body was discovered beneath a hedge. Reports later connected to the investigation described repeated stab wounds inflicted with scissors, along with evidence that the violence continued even after death. The details horrified both investigators and the public. Child murders often create a particularly intense emotional response within communities because they destroy the assumption that innocence itself offers protection. In Dusseldorf, Rosa's death intensified an already growing sense that something monstrous was moving through the city. Parents who had previously followed newspaper reports with concern now experienced something closer. The terror. The image of a child attacked with such brutality transformed fear into obsession. Citizens demanded answers from police. Newspapers published increasingly dramatic coverage. Rumors spread rapidly through neighborhoods. each retelling making the unknown killer seem even more frightening. Yet despite public pressure, the attacks continued. Another major case involved a woman named Maria Hahn. Unlike some earlier attacks that appeared sudden or opportunistic, this crime demonstrated Curtin's ability to manipulate trust before violence erupted. According to later confessions, he approached Maria politely and behaved like an ordinary man engaging in conversation. There was no immediate indication of danger. At some point, he convinced her to accompany him toward the woods near Neanderthal. The setting itself carries symbolic weight in the history of the case. Forested areas often represented temporary escape from crowded industrial city life. But in this instance, isolation created vulnerability. Once alone in the woods, Curtin attacked with extreme violence, stabbing Maria repeatedly in the head, chest, and neck. During later interrogations, he confessed to drinking blood from the wounds and described becoming sexually excited by the sight of blood flowing. Those admissions helped explain why newspapers eventually adopted the term vampire. But behind the sensational nickname existed a far more disturbing reality. Investigators were confronting a killer whose violence and sexual gratification had become inseparably linked. As more attacks occurred, medical examiners and detectives noticed recurring features that deeply unsettled them. Some victims suffered dozens of wounds despite already being dead. The excessive violence served no practical purpose in committing murder. Investigators increasingly believed that the injuries themselves represented part of the killers. Psychological compulsion. In several child murder cases, the brutality extended beyond what authorities considered rational even within violent crime. These observations later became central to criminological discussions about lustmord, or murder committed for sexual or emotional gratification through violence itself. But for ordinary citizens living in Dusseldorf at the time, psychological terminology mattered far less than survival. Fear changed daily behavior across the city. Children were forbidden from playing outside after dark. Women avoided isolated roads whenever possible. Police patrols increased dramatically, with officers monitoring streets, parks, and train stations late into the night. Yet despite these efforts, the killer remained unidentified. The inability of authorities to stop the attacks intensified public anxiety. Every new headline reinforced the sense that the city had lost control. Newspapers fueled the panic further by publishing extensive coverage of the murders. Descriptions of bloodshed and rumors about a vampire created an atmosphere where imagination often became more frightening than confirmed facts. Citizens speculated constantly about the identity of the killer. Some believed the crimes must involve a madman visibly detached from reality. Others suspected organized groups or multiple murderers because the attacks seemed too varied for one offender alone. Suspicion spread through communities. Strangers became objects of fear. In some neighborhoods, even familiar faces were viewed differently once darkness fell. Yet through all of this, Curtin remained hidden in plain sight. One of the most psychologically disturbing details later revealed during investigations was his fascination with public fear. He reportedly followed media coverage obsessively and enjoyed watching the city react to his crimes. Some accounts stated that he revisited crime scenes after attacks to observe investigators and crowds gathering around the locations. This behavior suggested that the murders alone were not enough. He also wanted to witness the emotional consequences spreading outward from them, the panic, confusion, and helplessness affecting thousands of strangers who did not yet know his identity. The city itself slowly transformed under the pressure of repeated violence. Dusseldorf in 1929 became a place where ordinary routines felt uncertain. The distance between home and work no longer seemed harmless after sunset. Parents waited anxiously for children returning from school or errands. Police officers faced mounting criticism as citizens demanded immediate arrests. Every unsolved attack increased public frustration and fear. And because the victims varied so dramatically, authorities struggled to establish predictive patterns. Some attacks appeared sexually motivated. Others resembled sudden explosions of violence. Different weapons and circumstances complicated efforts to build a coherent profile. In reality, the apparent chaos reflected the compulsive nature of Curtin's violence. He targeted vulnerability itself rather than one specific category of victim. Looking back historically, one of the most haunting aspects of the Dusseldorf murders is the way terror spread not only through physical violence, but through uncertainty. Citizens could not determine where danger existed because the killer moved unpredictably between victims and locations. Fear became psychological as much as physical. People began imagining threat everywhere. Every dark street carried possibility. Every unfamiliar face inspired suspicion. And while the public searched desperately for explanations, the man responsible continued watching from within the same frightened city. The attacks connected to Peter Curtin eventually became some of the most infamous crimes in German history, not simply because of brutality, but because they exposed how vulnerable society could become when confronted with apparently motiveless violence. There was no ransom demand, no political agenda, no revenge narrative that allowed people to impose logical order onto events. The murders appeared driven by impulses many citizens could barely comprehend. That incomprehensibility deepened the horror surrounding the case. And still, despite growing panic and intensified police efforts, investigators remained unable to stop him. Dusseldorf had entered a nightmare without understanding when it would end, or how many more victims would suffer before the killer was finally identified. By the end of 1929, the investigation into the murders terrorizing Dusseldorf had become one of the most intense criminal inquiries in Germany. Police departments faced enormous pressure from both the public and the press. Yet despite increased patrols, growing manpower, and constant media attention, the killer remained unidentified. Every new attack deepened the sense of failure surrounding the investigation. Citizens no longer simply feared the unknown murderer stalking the city. Many had also begun losing confidence in the ability of authorities to stop him. The central problem facing investigators was inconsistency. In many serial murder cases, detectives search for patterns that connect victims, methods, and locations. But the crimes associated with Peter Curtin often appeared chaotic. The victims varied dramatically in age and background. Some attacks involved children, others adult women. Different weapons had been used, including knives, scissors, and hammers. Certain victims survived assaults, while others did not. Some crime scenes suggested sexual motivation, while others appeared driven purely by violence. From the perspective of investigators at the time, it was difficult to determine whether these crimes belonged to one offender or several unrelated attackers operating simultaneously. That uncertainty became one of the greatest obstacles in the case. Each new incident generated additional leads, additional rumors, and additional public panic. Police departments received reports from frightened citizens accusing neighbors, strangers, co-workers, and travelers. Some witnesses believed they had seen suspicious men near parks or rail stations. Others claimed the killer was part of a criminal network. Newspapers fueled the atmosphere further by publishing dramatic headlines and descriptions connected to the so-called vampire of Dusseldorf. The nickname itself increased public hysteria because it transformed the killer into something almost mythical in the minds of many citizens. Rumors spread faster than facts. Fear distorted perception. Ordinary coincidences began appearing sinister. And all the while, the man responsible remained hidden within the city itself. The strain on investigators grew severe. Detectives worked long hours examining crime scenes, questioning witnesses, and attempting to establish links between attacks that often seemed disconnected. Every unsolved murder intensified scrutiny from the public. Police patrols increased throughout Dusseldorf, especially at night. Officers monitored streets, parks, wooded areas, and transportation routes. Yet the attacks continued. Looking back historically, one of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation is how close authorities often seem to the truth without fully recognizing it. They understood they were dealing with extreme violence. They understood the attacks involved sadistic elements. But the psychological profile later associated with Peter Curtin, a seemingly ordinary man capable of blending into society while secretly driven by compulsive bloodlust, remained difficult for many people at the time to fully comprehend. The breakthrough in the case eventually emerged not from a dramatic confrontation or advanced forensic discovery, but from an accident involving a letter. That detail remains one of the strangest and most important turning points in the investigation. It began with a woman named Maria Budlick. According to accounts connected to the case, Budlick survived an attack by Curtin after he lured her into a wooded area. Unlike many victims, she escaped with her life. Survival in cases involving serial offenders often becomes critically important because it provides investigators with direct testimony about the attacker's behavior, appearance, and methods. Yet surviving violent assaults also leaves victims carrying enormous trauma. Attempting to describe such experiences can be psychologically overwhelming, especially when fear, confusion, and shock remain fresh. After the attack, Maria Budlick reportedly wrote a letter describing what had happened to her. The letter was intended for a friend. At first glance, nothing about that act seemed extraordinary. A survivor attempting to process trauma by sharing her experience privately is deeply human. But fate intervened in an unexpected way. The letter was misdelivered and eventually reached police investigators instead. That mistake changed the entire direction of the case. Within the contents of the letter were details about the attacker and the circumstances surrounding the assault. Investigators studying the information recognized elements that aligned with the broader pattern of violence terrorizing Dusseldorf. For the first time, authorities began moving closer toward identifying a specific suspect rather than chasing disconnected theories. The significance of the letter also reveals an uncomfortable truth about criminal investigations. Sometimes major breakthroughs emerge not solely through brilliant deduction, but through chance. In this case, a misdirected piece of correspondence became the opening investigators desperately needed. Once police focused more closely on the information connected to Maria Budlick's experience, suspicion increasingly turned toward Peter Curtin. Quietly, investigators began building a clearer picture of the man they believed responsible for the attacks. The pressure surrounding the case at this stage was enormous. Authorities understood that if their suspicions were correct, they were dealing with one of the most dangerous offenders in modern German history. Yet despite the mounting evidence, the eventual conclusion of the investigation did not involve a violent shootout, dramatic pursuit, or public confrontation. Instead, the final unraveling of Peter Curtin's freedom revealed another disturbing aspect of his psychology: his extraordinary emotional detachment. According to reports later connected to the case, Curtin became aware that investigators were closing in on him. There was a reward being offered related to the murders. And in one of the strangest details of the investigation, he reportedly told his wife that she should surrender him to authorities in order to claim the reward money. The statement shocked investigators because it reflected a level of cold practicality almost impossible for ordinary people to understand. By this stage, Curtin had already allegedly committed numerous murders and attacks. Entire communities had lived under fear because of his actions. Yet when capture appeared inevitable, he approached the situation with apparent calmness, even encouraging his own betrayal if it could provide financial benefit. His wife eventually cooperated with police, and investigators moved toward arrest. Unlike the panic that had defined the months leading up to this moment, the actual capture itself unfolded without dramatic public spectacle. There was no cinematic chase through dark streets, no final desperate attempt to escape. Instead, the arrest represented the quiet collapse of a hidden identity that had survived for years beneath the surface of ordinary life. For citizens of Dusseldorf, the news brought a mixture of relief, disbelief, and exhaustion. After months of terror, authorities were finally claiming they had identified the man responsible. Yet even then, some people struggled to accept the idea that one individual alone could have committed so many attacks across such a wide range of victims and locations. The scale of violence had seemed almost beyond comprehension. Once in custody, however, Peter Curtin began confessing. And those confessions transformed the investigation from a search for an unknown killer into one attempt to understand one of the most psychologically disturbing offenders investigators had ever encountered. He admitted to multiple murders, attempted murders, sexual assaults, and acts of arson. More horrifying still were his descriptions of the emotional and sexual gratification he experienced from bloodshed itself. Investigators who listened to these confessions found themselves confronting not only the facts of violent crime, but the terrifying reality that some of the acts had been committed purely to satisfy compulsions rooted in sadism and blood fixation. The case also exposed the limitations of investigative methods available during that period. Modern forensic science, behavioral profiling, and centralized criminal databases did not yet exist in forms recognizable today. Detectives relied heavily on witness testimony, physical observation, confessions, and painstaking manual investigation. The fact that Curtin remained undetected for so long reflected both the chaotic nature of his crimes and the technological limitations of law enforcement during the era. Yet even within those limitations, the investigation eventually succeeded because fragments of evidence slowly accumulated until the truth became impossible to ignore. Looking back, the turning point involving Maria Budlick's letter carries almost symbolic significance. The city had spent months trapped beneath fear, uncertainty, and rumor. Citizens imagined monsters, conspiracies, and invisible predators. But ultimately, the breakthrough came through something painfully human. The testimony of a survivor attempting to describe what had happened to her. That testimony helped transform chaos into clarity. It gave investigators direction at a moment when the case seemed almost impossible to solve. And once Peter Curtin entered police custody, Dusseldorf finally began emerging from the nightmare that had consumed it. But although the investigation was ending, another ordeal was only beginning. Because the confessions, psychiatric examinations, an eventual trial would force both Germany and the wider world to confront questions far more disturbing than the identity of the killer alone. The public now knew who had committed the crimes. The harder question became understanding how a seemingly ordinary man had carried such darkness inside him for so many years while moving unnoticed through everyday life. That question would dominate the courtroom soon to come. When Peter Curtin was finally taken into custody, the fear that had gripped Dusseldorf for months did not disappear overnight. The streets were no longer haunted by uncertainty in the same way they had been during the height of the murders. But relief quickly gave way to another kind of horror. Citizens now faced the reality that the man responsible for the violence was not a supernatural figure, nor a visibly deranged outcast hiding outside society. He was a real human being who had lived among ordinary people while secretly committing acts that shocked the nation. And as investigators began questioning him in detail, the case grew even more disturbing. In many murder investigations, suspects deny responsibility for as long as possible. Others minimize their crimes or attempt to redirect blame. Peter Curtin did something different. During interrogations, he confessed extensively. The scale of what he admitted stunned investigators. He confessed to 9 murders, more than 30 attempted murders, multiple sexual assaults, and acts of arson. But it was not only the quantity of violence that horrified authorities. It was the emotional coldness with which he described it. According to accounts from the investigation, Curtin spoke openly about the role blood played in his psychological and sexual gratification. He admitted that watching blood flow from victims excited him intensely. He stated that even hearing about violent crimes or reading reports involving murder could arouse him sexually. The confessions forced investigators to confront a type of offender many struggled to fully comprehend. These were not crimes committed for financial gain or personal revenge. The violence itself appeared to be the source of pleasure. For police officers, journalists, and ordinary citizens following the case, this realization deepened the horror surrounding the murders. Until then, many people had still searched for rational explanations that fit familiar motives. But Curtin's statements suggested something more frightening. He killed because the acts fulfilled compulsions rooted in bloodlust, domination, and sadistic gratification. The nickname, the Vampire of Dusseldorf, once viewed partly as sensational journalism, now seemed disturbingly appropriate to the public. During questioning, investigators also learned more about the psychological pleasure Curtin experienced from public fear. He admitted enjoying newspaper coverage of the murders and following reports describing panic throughout the city. According to later accounts, he took satisfaction from watching society react to crimes while knowing he alone understood the truth behind them. This emotional dynamic became central to understanding his behavior. The murders were not isolated explosions of violence disconnected from public reaction. The fear spreading through Dusseldorf formed part of the gratification. Every headline, every rumor, every frightened family contributed indirectly to the sense of power he experienced. One of the most important figures involved in examining Curtin's psychology was Carl Berg, the criminologist and psychologist who later studied him extensively. Berg approached the case not simply as a criminal investigation, but as an opportunity to understand the inner workings of a deeply abnormal mind. At the time, the concept of lustmord, or lust murder, had already entered criminological discussion in Germany, referring to killings driven by sexual gratification connected to violence itself. But Curtin represented one of the most extreme examples investigators had encountered. Berg's interviews revealed a man capable of discussing horrific acts with unsettling calmness. That calmness became one of the defining impressions left on those who observed him. There was no theatrical insanity, no uncontrollable rage erupting during interrogations. Instead, Curtin often appeared composed and self-aware. This outward normality disturbed people almost as much as the murders themselves because it challenged assumptions about what evil should look like. Society often imagines violent predators as visibly monstrous individuals who can be recognized immediately. But Peter Curtin demonstrated something far more uncomfortable. A person capable of extraordinary cruelty could also appear polite, controlled, and socially functional. Berg later described Curtin as one of the most extreme lust murder cases ever studied. The interviews explored the connections between violence, sexuality, and psychological compulsion inside the killer's mind. According to reports from the time, Curtin described experiencing overwhelming excitement from bloodshed. The sight of blood itself became central to his fantasies and actions. Investigators examining the murders retrospectively began recognizing patterns that now seemed unmistakable. the excessive wounds inflicted on victims, the post-mortem violence, and the apparent frenzy at certain crime scenes all aligned with the compulsions Curtin described during interrogation. Yet even while psychologists attempted to analyze him scientifically, the public viewed the case through a mixture of fascination and horror. Germany followed developments obsessively. Newspapers covered every detail of the investigation, confessions, and upcoming trial. Crowds gathered outside courthouses hoping to glimpse the man responsible for the murders. The case had transformed from a regional criminal investigation into a national spectacle. But beneath the public fascination remained immense grief. Families of victims now faced the painful reality of hearing details about crimes revisited publicly. During legal proceedings, every confession, every courtroom statement, every psychological analysis forced survivors and communities to relive the terror that had consumed Dusseldorf. When the trial finally began in 1931, the atmosphere surrounding the courtroom reflected both outrage and fear. Authorities reportedly placed Curtin inside a protective cage during proceedings because of concerns that enraged citizens might attempt to attack or kill him. That image became symbolic of the case itself. A man isolated behind metal barriers while society attempted to confront the scale of violence he had unleashed. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors detailed the murders and assaults connected to him. The public heard descriptions of attacks against children, women, and random victims selected seemingly without mercy. The emotional impact of the testimony was enormous. Observers struggled to reconcile the calm figure sitting before them with the brutality described. Throughout the proceedings, the contrast between Curtin's outward composure and the savage nature of the crimes created a psychological tension that haunted many who followed the case. During the trial, the confessions played a central role. Investigators no longer needed to prove simply that Curtin committed the murders. The challenge became presenting the full scope of his actions and psychological state to the court. Discussions about insanity inevitably emerged. How could someone commit such acts unless mentally disturbed? Yet the issue was more complicated than simple madness. Curtin demonstrated awareness of his crimes. He understood consequences. He took steps to avoid capture. He manipulated victims and concealed his identity successfully for years. These behaviors suggested planning and control rather than complete detachment from reality. This distinction mattered legally because it influenced questions surrounding criminal responsibility. In the end, the court found him responsible for his actions. He was sentenced to death by guillotine. For many citizens, the verdict represented the official conclusion of a nightmare that had terrorized Dusseldorf and captivated Germany. Yet even as execution approached, Peter Curtin continued displaying the same disturbing psychological fixation that had defined the murders themselves. According to accounts that later became infamous worldwide, he made a final statement before execution that horrified nearly everyone who heard it. He reportedly asked whether, after his head had been severed by the guillotine, he would still be able to hear the sound of his own blood rushing from his neck. The statement became legendary not because it sounded theatrical, but because it revealed how completely blood and violence dominated his thinking even at the moment of death. Most condemned prisoners facing execution express fear, regret, denial, or desperation. Curtin instead remained fixated on blood. The remarks cemented his reputation in history as the vampire of Dusseldorf. But beyond the sensationalism, the statement revealed something profoundly tragic about the psychological prison inside which he seemed to exist. Even with death moments away, the compulsions that had driven his crimes still controlled his imagination. In 1931, Peter Curtin was executed by guillotine. Officially, the reign of terror that had haunted Dusseldorf was over. The killer was dead. The investigation had ended. the city could finally breathe without fearing another attack. Yet executions rarely bring true closure in cases involving such extensive trauma. Families of victims still carried unimaginable grief. Survivors remained haunted by memories of violence. Police officers, investigators, and medical personnel who worked the case carried psychological scars of their own. And beyond Germany, criminologists and psychologists continued studying the case for years because it forced society to confront deeply uncomfortable truths about human violence. One of the most enduring questions surrounding Peter Curtin was never simply how he killed, but how he lived among ordinary people for so long without detection. He exposed the terrifying reality that monstrous acts do not always emerge from visibly monstrous individuals. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those capable of appearing entirely ordinary until the moment violence erupts. That realization lingered long after the execution chamber fell silent. The trial had ended. The sentence had been carried out. But the shadow left behind by the vampire of Dusseldorf was far from over. After the execution of Peter Curtin in 1931, Dusseldorf slowly began returning to something resembling ordinary life. The headlines faded. Police patrols eventually became less intense. Streets that had once emptied in fear after sunset gradually filled again with workers, children, and families attempting to reclaim routines that violence had disrupted for months. On the surface, the nightmare appeared finished. The man responsible for the murders was dead. The investigation had closed. The city no longer lived beneath the immediate threat of another attack. But in cases involving prolonged public terror, endings are rarely clean. Fear does not disappear the moment a killer is arrested or executed. Trauma lingers quietly inside the people forced to live through it. For many families in Dusseldorf, the aftermath of the murders was not measured in newspaper cycles or courtroom verdicts. It was measured in empty chairs at dinner tables, in children who never came home, in routines forever altered by grief and fear. One of the dangers in discussing infamous serial murder cases is the tendency for the offender to overshadow the victims entirely. Names like the Vampire of Dusseldorf survive because sensational labels are memorable. But behind every headline connected to Peter Curtin were real human beings whose lives ended violently and whose families carried the consequences long after public attention moved elsewhere. Children like Rosa Olliger were not symbols inside a criminal case while they were alive. They were daughters, members of communities, ordinary people whose futures were stolen permanently. Women targeted by Curtin were not simply victims in the abstract sense. They were individuals who trusted someone they believed harmless, only to encounter unimaginable violence. In many ways, the true aftermath of the case existed not in the execution chamber, but in the quiet years afterward when families were left to rebuild lives around absence. The city itself also carried psychological scars. During the height of the murders, Dusseldorf experienced something more than fear of crime. Citizens experienced the collapse of ordinary certainty. Public spaces that once felt familiar suddenly appeared threatening. Parents who had previously considered neighborhoods safe began seeing danger everywhere. The attacks transformed routine activities, walking home after dark, traveling alone, allowing children outside, into sources of anxiety. Even after Curtin's death, memories of that fear remained embedded within public consciousness. People who lived through 1929 remembered the tension of reading newspapers each morning wondering whether another body had been discovered overnight. They remembered police whistles echoing through dark streets and conversations dominated by rumors about an unseen killer moving among them. Historical cases like this remind us that serial violence damages not only direct victims, but entire communities forced into prolonged uncertainty. Yet beyond Dusseldorf itself, the case also left a lasting impact on criminology and forensic psychology. Investigators and psychologists studying Curtin became increasingly focused on understanding offenders whose crimes appeared connected to sexual gratification, sadism, and compulsive violence. Before the 20th century, many societies explained extreme acts of murder through moral weakness, insanity, or supernatural ideas about evil. But cases like Curtin's forced researchers to examine the psychological structures underlying repetitive violent behavior in more systematic ways. The term Lustmord, already present within German criminology, became more widely associated with discussions about offenders who derived emotional or sexual satisfaction from killing. The interviews conducted by Carl Berg contributed significantly to these conversations. Berg's work examining Curtin attempted to explore how violence, blood fixation, domination, and sexuality had become psychologically intertwined inside the killer's mind. While modern criminal psychology has evolved enormously since the 1930s, the Curtin case remained historically important because it represented one of the earliest highly publicized examples of investigators trying to understand serial murder through psychological analysis rather than viewing it solely as isolated criminal behavior. The case also highlighted how difficult it can be to identify violent offenders who outwardly appear ordinary. Peter Curtin did not resemble the exaggerated image of a monster many citizens imagined while the murders were occurring. He blended into society. He interacted normally with people around him. He followed news coverage of his own crimes while remaining undetected for years. That contradiction continues haunting discussions about violent offenders today because it challenges the comforting belief that danger is always visible. Often it is not. Society repeatedly searches for obvious signs that separate predators from everyone else. But one of the most disturbing lessons of the Dusseldorf murders is that horrific violence can exist beneath surfaces appearing entirely normal. The cultural impact of the case extended far beyond criminology. The murders and the atmosphere of fear surrounding them influenced literature, journalism, and cinema. Most notably, the famous German film drew inspiration from serial murder cases that terrified Germany during that era, including the crimes associated with Peter Curtin. The film explored themes of public panic, mob justice, fear of hidden predators, and the psychological anxiety created when society realizes danger can move invisibly within ordinary life. Even decades later, echoes of the Dusseldorf murders continued appearing in true crime writing, documentaries, and psychological studies. Yet the enduring fascination with cases like this creates ethical questions as well. Why do certain crimes remain embedded in public memory long after others fade? Part of the answer lies in fear. Serial murder cases strike deeply at the human need to believe the world follows understandable rules. Crimes motivated by greed, jealousy, or revenge at least appear connected to recognizable human emotions. But compulsive violence without clear, rational motive unsettles people differently because it seems unpredictable and difficult to prevent. Peter Curtin frightened society not only because he killed, but because his motivations appeared alien to ordinary emotional experience. The idea that bloodshed itself could become a source of pleasure challenged basic assumptions about human behavior. At the same time, there is always a danger that notorious offenders become mythologized over time. Nicknames like the Vampire of Dusseldorf can unintentionally transform real suffering into dark folklore. That is why it remains important to separate historical reality from sensationalism. Peter Curtin was not a supernatural creature emerging from nightmares. He was a human being responsible for horrific crimes against vulnerable people. understanding that humanity matters because it prevents society from distancing itself too easily from the uncomfortable realities these cases reveal. Evil does not always arrive wearing a monstrous face. Sometimes it exists quietly behind ordinary appearances until violence exposes what was hidden underneath. Another enduring aspect of the case involves the role of chance in criminal investigations. For months, police struggled unsuccessfully to identify the killer despite widespread panic and extensive investigative efforts. Ultimately, one of the most important breakthroughs emerged because a survivor's letter was accidentally delivered into police hands. That detail remains profoundly unsettling because it suggests how close the investigation may have come to failure. Without that accident, how much longer might the murders have continued? How many additional victims might have suffered? Cases like this often force societies to confront uncomfortable truths about uncertainty and vulnerability. Even determined investigations can depend partly on coincidence. Even dangerous offenders can remain hidden for years. And even after justice arrives legally, emotional closure remains elusive for many survivors and families. Perhaps the most haunting element of Peter Curtin's story is not the brutality alone, but the emptiness at its center. Throughout the murders, the confessions, and even the moments before execution, he appeared consumed by compulsions that never truly satisfied him. Violence escalated repeatedly. The fear spreading through Dusseldorf became part of the gratification. Blood itself became psychologically central to his fantasies. Yet nothing ever seemed enough to stop the cycle voluntarily. In that sense, the case reveals something profoundly tragic about unchecked sadism and compulsive violence. They destroy not only victims and communities, but also the humanity of the offender himself. By the time Curtin faced execution, he seemed almost entirely defined by obsession. His infamous final question about hearing his own blood after decapitation remains horrifying, precisely because it demonstrates how deeply violence had colonized his thoughts. Even death became filtered through blood fascination. And perhaps that is why the case still lingers in historical memory nearly a century later. Not because people admire the killer, but because the story forces confrontation with difficult questions about violence, trauma, psychology, and the fragile boundaries separating ordinary life from terror. Today, Dusseldorf is no longer the fearful city it became in 1929. The streets are busy again. Children walk through neighborhoods once haunted by panic. Most people moving through the city know little about the fear that once gripped it. Time has a way of covering even the darkest events beneath layers of ordinary life. But history does not disappear completely. Cases like this survive because they reveal something enduring about both human vulnerability and human resilience. The city recovered. Families endured unimaginable grief and somehow continued living. Investigators adapted and learned lessons that influenced future criminal psychology. Society confronted fears that once seemed incomprehensible and gradually moved forward. Yet the shadow of the vampire of Dusseldorf never vanished entirely from public memory. It remains as a reminder that the most frightening dangers are often not the supernatural monsters imagined in folklore, but the real human beings capable of carrying extraordinary darkness behind ordinary faces. And in the end, perhaps that is the final lesson left behind by Peter Curtin. The true horror of the case was never simply the bloodshed itself. It was the realization that evil had walked unnoticed through crowded streets, sat quietly among ordinary citizens, read newspapers describing its own crimes, and watched fear spread through an entire city while appearing to almost everyone around him completely normal. The streets of Dusseldorf eventually became quiet again. But for those who lived through the terror of 1929, some part of that fear likely remained forever, hidden in memories of dark roads. unanswered questions, and the knowledge that for a time, a predator had moved invisibly among them. There is something uniquely unsettling about crimes that continue haunting public memory long after. Everyone directly involved is gone. Many murders fade into history as records inside forgotten archives. Their details eventually swallowed by time. But certain cases survive generation after generation because they touch something deeper than curiosity. They force society to confront uncomfortable truths about fear, violence, and human nature itself. The story of Peter Curtin became one of those cases. Nearly a century later, the name still appears in books, documentaries, criminology studies, and discussions about the psychology of serial murder. Yet what continues haunting people is not only the brutality of crimes. It is the atmosphere surrounding them, the image of an ordinary city slowly consumed by fear while the man responsible walked unnoticed among the population. In many ways, the Dusseldorf murders represented more than a criminal investigation. They became a portrait of society, realizing that danger does not always announce itself clearly. During the months of terror in 1929, citizens searched desperately for reassurance. They wanted to believe the killer would look visibly monstrous, that evil could somehow be recognized on sight. But Peter Curtin shattered that illusion. Witnesses and investigators alike described someone capable of appearing calm, polite, and socially functional. He was not isolated from society. He moved within it. And that reality remains deeply disturbing because it undermines one of humanity's most comforting assumptions: the belief that the truly dangerous can always be identified before harm occurs. Cases like this also reveal how fear transforms communities. Before the murders, Dusseldorf was simply a city filled with ordinary routines. Workers traveled familiar streets. Children played outside. Families built predictable lives around schedules, neighborhoods, and habits repeated daily. But fear changes the meaning of ordinary places. A quiet road becomes threatening after sunset. A stranger's smile begins to feel suspicious. Parents stop trusting familiar surroundings. During the height of the investigation, the city itself seemed psychologically altered. People no longer moved through public spaces with the same confidence. Every new newspaper headline intensified the tension. Every unsolved attack expanded uncertainty. Citizens did not merely fear becoming victims. They feared not knowing where danger existed. That uncertainty can be psychologically devastating because human beings naturally search for patterns and explanations during crisis. The Dusseldorf murders offered very few comforting answers. Even after the arrest and execution of Curtin, the emotional consequences remained. Trauma rarely ends cleanly. Survivors carry memories that continue shaping their lives long after public attention disappears. Families connected to victims had to live with unimaginable absence while the rest of society slowly moved forward. Communities forced to endure prolonged fear often emerge permanently changed, even if those changes become invisible over time. Children who grew up during the murders likely remembered adults speaking in frightened whispers about a killer roaming the city. Parents remembered waiting anxiously for loved ones to return home safely after dark. Police officers remembered the exhaustion and pressure of chasing an offender who seemed to vanish repeatedly into ordinary life. History often reduces such experiences into timelines and summaries. But for those who lived through them, the fear was immediate and personal. Another reason the case continues attracting attention is the disturbing psychological insight revealed through Curtin's confessions. During his interrogations, he described bloodlust, sexual gratification connected to violence, an emotional pleasure derived from public fear. Those admissions force criminologists to examine forms of compulsive violence that many people at the time struggled even to conceptualize. prior to the 20th century, society often explained extreme brutality through broad ideas like madness or moral corruption. But the Dusseldorf murders highlighted something more complicated. Curtin appeared capable of understanding his actions rationally while simultaneously being driven by compulsions tied deeply to sadism and blood fixation. This distinction influenced the development of modern criminal psychology and forensic profiling in important ways. Researchers studying violent offenders increasingly recognized that serial murder could involve patterns of fantasy, ritualized behavior, emotional gratification, and psychological escalation rather than spontaneous rage alone. The work conducted by Carl Berg became historically significant because it attempted to document these psychological mechanisms systematically. Even today, criminologists studying violent offenders often revisit historical cases like Curtin's because they provide early insight into compulsive homicidal behavior. Yet there's also a moral tension in discussing notorious killers. Society remains fascinated by cases involving extreme violence. But fascination can easily drift toward mythologizing offenders instead of remembering victims. Nicknames such as the Vampire of Dusseldorf create memorable imagery that survives culturally, sometimes overshadowing the lives destroyed beneath the mythology. This happens repeatedly throughout true crime history. The offender becomes infamous while victims gradually disappear from public memory. But if there is any responsible way to revisit cases like this, it requires remembering that the true story is not about the killer's legend. It is about the people whose lives ended violently and the communities forced to endure fear because of his actions. One of the most tragic realities of serial violence is how random it often feels to victims. The individuals targeted by Curtin were not famous figures or powerful people protected by security and status. Many were simply vulnerable individuals crossing paths with the wrong person at the wrong moment. Children walking home, women accepting conversation from someone who appeared harmless, ordinary citizens moving through everyday routines. That randomness intensified the horror because it stripped away the comforting illusion that danger always follows predictable rules. Looking back now from the perspective of modern true crime analysis, it can be tempting to search the story for hidden clues or inevitable warning signs that should have prevented the murders earlier. Certainly, there were disturbing indicators in Curtin's history: childhood cruelty toward animals, fascination with blood, escalating violent behavior, and prior criminal acts. But hindsight creates clarity unavailable to people living events in real time. Investigators in the early 20th century lacked many forensic and psychological tools considered standard today. There were no computerized criminal databases, no modern profiling systems, no DNA analysis. Police often relied heavily on witness statements, confessions, and physical observation. The fact that Curtin avoided capture for so long reflected not only his manipulative behavior, but also the limitations of investigative systems during that era. Even the final breakthrough emerged partly through chance: a misdelivered letter from survivor Maria Budlick that reached investigators unexpectedly. That detail remains haunting because it suggests how fragile the path toward justice sometimes becomes. History is filled with moments where tiny accidents alter enormous outcomes. Without that letter, the murders may have continued far longer. The cultural legacy of the case also endured through art and cinema. Fear surrounding hidden predators moving through urban society became a recurring theme in German storytelling during the early 20th century. The influence of the Dusseldorf murders could be felt most famously in M, which explored themes of paranoia, mob fear, public hysteria, and the terrifying realization that monstrous violence can hide beneath ordinary appearances. The film's atmosphere echoed the anxieties that had consumed Germany during the era of curtains. Crimes. Even today, modern crime fiction and psychological thrillers continue drawing upon fears first intensified by historical cases like this one. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Peter Curtin's story is how little emotional resolution it ultimately offers. Some criminal cases conclude with clear moral clarity, a motive explained, justice achieved, order restored. The Dusseldorf murders resist that simplicity. Even after the arrest, confessions, and execution, the central horror remained difficult to fully process because the motivations themselves seemed so alien to ordinary experience. Bloodshed was not merely a tool for Curtin. It became emotionally and sexually central to his compulsions. Public panic itself became rewarding to him. Violence escalated because previous acts no longer satisfied the impulses driving him. These realities force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the extremes of human psychology. There is no satisfying explanation capable of fully reducing such behavior into something easily understandable. And maybe that is why the case still lingers so powerfully in public memory. Human beings naturally seek stories with clear meaning. But some crimes leave behind only fragments of understanding, surrounded by grief and unanswered questions. In the decades following the murders, Dusseldorf continued changing, modernizing, and growing like every major European city. New generations filled streets once haunted by fear. Buildings changed. Newspapers stopped printing daily reports about a killer. Life moved forward because societies always move forward eventually, even after trauma. Yet history has a long memory. Beneath ordinary modern life lie echoes of earlier fears carried silently through time. Somewhere in old archives remain photographs, police reports, witness statements, and newspaper headlines documenting the months when an entire city feared the dark. Somewhere in forgotten family histories remain memories of children warned not to walk alone after sunset because a murderer was still free. And somewhere within the broader history of criminology remains the shadow of a case that changed how investigators thought about serial violence forever. In the end, perhaps the story of the vampire of Dusseldorf is not ultimately about one man alone. It is about vulnerability, about fear spreading through ordinary lives, about how violence can fracture a community's sense of safety almost overnight. And it is about the unsettling realization that evil rarely arrives in forms people expect. Sometimes it moves quietly through crowded streets wearing an ordinary face, unnoticed until tragedy forces society to look closer. The murders committed by Peter Curtin ended nearly a century ago. But the questions raised by the case about violence, psychology, fear, and the hidden darkness human beings may carry inside themselves never truly disappeared. That is why the story still endures. Not because the killer deserves remembrance, but because the fear he created revealed something timeless and deeply human. The streets of Dusseldorf eventually became quiet again. The headlines faded. The crowds outside the courthouse disappeared. But for those who survived that era, there were likely moments long afterward, hearing footsteps behind them at night, waiting for a child to return home, reading reports of another violent crime somewhere far away, when memories of 1929 briefly returned. And in those moments, the shadow of the so-called vampire of Dusseldorf still lingered.